Is the Rebbitzin on?
I'm here.
No, but is the Rebbitzin on to introduce you?
I don't know.
Okay, so Linda, you want to introduce? Linda, do you have the?
Do you hear me now? Do you hear me? You know me? Do you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you. Yeah, go ahead. We don't hear you again, Rebbitzin. Linda, you want to go ahead? Linda, you want to take yourself off video and introduce
I would love to.
Our speaker? Please go. Thanks, Linda. Thank you so much.
I don't have the.
And I apologize to this. I apologize. Please forgive us for this little bit of a glitch. Go ahead.
I would love to. I don't have the bio. I'm just looking.
It's in the morning Nishmas. It's right there.
Is this the one? Do you have a master's in Judaic studies, Yaeli?
I do.
Okay,
yes.
So that's the one. Okay, that's the one. I'll read that one. So on behalf of everyone, I wish you a very warm and hearty welcome to our Nishmat group. Yaeli has a master's in Judaic studies from Columbia University, which is really a very highly esteemed university for those that don't realize. She's taught Tanakh at Ramaz High School for years before joining the Judaic Studies faculty at Stern College for Women. She moved with her family to Israel in 2014 and now lives in Modi'in and teaches at the Matan Women's Institute for Learning in Yerushalayim. We very much look forward to hearing what you have to say, Yaeli. And once again, sorry for the little slip up as we were finding the people involved. We look forward.
Thank you. Should I start now?
Yes, please do.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me here. If I could just ask, we have someone very close to us, a beautiful little girl by the name of Esther Tehila, but Ariel Tzipora, that needs our tefillot very, very badly. So if I can just ask everyone that the learning today should be in Zchut Refuah Shlema for Esty.
Can you say the name again, please?
It's Esther Tehila, but Ariel Tzipora. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Megillat Esther to get everybody a little bit in the mood for Purim that's coming soon. And I wanted to start actually with a story. It's the legend, as the legend goes. In 1947, there was a young Bedouin boy who was walking with his animals in the Judean desert, and he tossed a little pebble into one of the caves. And he heard a plink, he heard a noise, he heard it, bouncing off of something that wasn't just the inside of a cave. And he walked in, and long story short, what he found there was really the beginnings of the discovery of what we know as the Qumran caves, the caves at Qumran, which is out in the Judean desert on the outskirts, outside of Yerushalayim. And it's not entirely clear. Scholars debate about who actually stored the scrolls there and who put things in. And there's lots of scholarly debate about the topic. But what's really, really interesting is that over the next decade or so, really from once Israel became a state and then in the following years, what archaeologists really discovered were close to 1,000 scrolls written by Jews during the period of the Second Beit HaMikdash. And it was a fascinating discovery because aside from just pushing back the oldest original text that we have of Tanakh over a millennia, right? Some of the best sort of extant versions of Sfarim in Tanakh that we had was only from the Middle Ages. This pushed us back in time over 1,000 years. But aside from it was a miraculous discovery, finding Sifrei Tanakh that had been hidden underground for over 2,000 years. One of the things that the discovery did really was give us tremendous insight into what Jews during the period of Bayit Sheni were thinking about, what they were talking about, some of the different halachic debates that were going on that we didn't know about until we found these scrolls. But what's most interesting for tonight's discussion, sorry, it's almost evening by me, but for your morning's discussion, is that one of the things that finding those scrolls really did was give us a sense of the works that Jews during the period of Bayit Sheni considered important and considered holy. Now, we have to remember, Chazal had not yet decided before the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash which books were going to belong in the Tanakh, which 24 books. We know that the Gemara discusses the debates that Chazal had when they were deciding which books should be included and which should not. And so one of the things that's interesting is that in this cave, that's almost like a time capsule from the period of Bayit Sheni, we find all 23 works of Tanakh, numerous copies of some of them, of Yeshayahu, of Yirmiyahu, of Amos, of Haggai. The only sefer that's not found amongst all these thousands of scrolls is Megillat Esther. Okay, which is something really, really interesting to think about. If we fast forward to the 1st century of the Common Era, which is around the exact same time that the Beit HaMikdash itself was destroyed, there was a historian known as Yosef ben Matityahu. In English, we call him Josephus. And one of the things that Josephus did was he wrote down, he actually escaped from Israel and he ran to Rome. And one of the things that he does is he writes the history of the Jewish people. And one of the things he mentions is that the Jewish people have what we now call a Tanakh, but he says there's only 22 books. And people that study Yosef ben Matityahu actually assume, for various reasons, that the two he left out, and he did not yet know were part of the canon, were Esther and Kohelet. Okay. Fast forward a few hundred years. If we open up in the Gemara, one of the things that's very, very interesting is even already in the time of the Gemara, so after the Tanakh was already sealed and after they decided which works were written b'nibuah and which ones are going to be considered the 24 books of Tanakh, there's still a debate going on in the Gemara about whether or not Esther is considered mitamah hayadayim, whether or not Esther defiles the hands, which is a sort of halachic concept that's sort of placed onto different works to describe whether or not they're considered kadosh, whether or not they're considered a sefer that belongs in Tanakh. Now, that's fascinating historically because we're already hundreds of years after the Tanakh was closed and after we have the 24 Sifrei Tanakh, and yet still the Amoraim are discussing whether or not Esther should have been included in the Chavdalit Sifrei Tanakh. Now, we can't really be sure, right? And we don't know why there are so many debates around Megillat Esther. We know that there are debates around, for example, Shir HaShirim. But one of the things that sort of we could try to think about is perhaps what might have made Esther questionable, or what might have made the work of Esther a sefer that the Amoraim were still debating and that the Chazal that originally formed the Tanakh were questioning and weren't entirely sure about, and that Jews, even in the Second Temple, the Jews that moved out to the desert didn't have Esther as one of their Sfarim. So what I want to sort of mention, and again, these are some of the suggestions, and what I think we're going to find so interesting is that the very things that might have made people hesitate to incorporate Megillat Esther into the Tanakh are the very things that make Megillat Esther so powerful and so meaningful, and why it's one of, perhaps we might even argue, one of the most popular books in all of Tanakh. So I'm going to throw out a couple of suggestions that the Mifarshim have discussed and that various Parshanim have really addressed. And the first one obviously goes without saying is that Megillat Esther was written outside of Israel. Right. And so it was a sefer that was not written like most of the other Sfarim in Tanakh within the land of Israel. And not only was it written outside of Israel, but it doesn't really focus on what was going on in Israel or in Yerushalayim. If we use as a point of comparison Sefer Daniel, because Sefer Daniel is really one of the only other Sfarim that was written outside of Eretz Yisrael during the experience of exile. So one of the things that we notice when we read Sefer Daniel is that Daniel is consumed by thoughts of Israel and by thoughts of the Chorban, and his tefillot are constantly couched in concern for Yerushalayim and for what's going on. And if we read from beginning to end in Megillat Esther, we don't find that. Right now, we know, because we study history, that Parasu Madai was in charge, really ruled all over the land that included both the area in which the Megillah takes place and also the land of Israel. Yerushalayim, what was then called the Judean province, was a province of the Persian Achaemenid dynasty. But Megillat Esther, if you were to read it, it's almost as if the reality that was happening inside the land, the Mikdash, the Jews that were living there, that were trying to sort of reinstate Judaism, it's almost not addressed at all. And so some Mefarshim suggest that maybe that's one of the reasons that Chazal were initially hesitant. The other suggestion, and I think this is probably pretty obvious to most people, is that Megillat Esther doesn't really have, on the surface, religious content. Right now, again, we're talking the pshat. I'm not addressing now all the midrashim and the mefarshim that instill or infuse religion into the text. But if you were just to give the pshat of the Megillah to someone to read without all the midrashim, without the mikra'ot gedolot, then they would find a text that doesn't really seem to have mitzvot inside of it, that doesn't really seem to address what it means to be a religious person. Right? Again, I'm going to use Sefer Daniel as a point of comparison. If you look in Sefer Daniel, Daniel was scrupulous. He too was in the Babylonian court, but he was scrupulous in his mitzvot at a great risk to himself. He risked his life numerous times. Once he refused to eat the food because it wasn't kosher. Once he refused to, he was thrown into the lion's den because he refused to bow down. And so over and over in Sefer Daniel, we have these really important religious elements and these mitzvot that in Megillat Esther we don't see. In Megillat Esther, and again, I'm keeping all of the midrashic explanations out of it. We're focusing now just on the pshat. In Megillat Esther, we have a Jewish woman marrying a non-Jewish man. We don't know what Esther was eating inside the palace, but in Sefer Daniel, we hear over and over how Daniel was so careful with kashrut, and in Esther, we assume she was, but the Megillah doesn't focus on it. It doesn't seem to be the focus. It doesn't seem to be the point. Right? And so if we compare the two Svarim, Sefer Daniel, where he risks his life and he's willing to die to keep the mitzvot, and Megillat Esther, where we see things happening and the Tanakh doesn't address, or the Megillah itself doesn't give explanations internally inside the text for what was going on. So that could be something that religious Jews who are deciding which Svarim should be part of the Tanakh might have trouble with, right? Now, I'll give you one other thing, and this, again, is obvious to most people, right? Most of us are familiar with the Midrash, that every time it says the name of Hashem, every time it says the word Melech, that it's really referring to Hashem, that it's sort of a secret code for Hashem. But again, if you're a Jew who's deciding which Sarim should be incorporated into Tanakh and which should be included and which don't belong, and you're debating Shir HaShirim and you're debating Megillat Esther and you're looking in Megillat Esther for Hashem, he's not there. Right? So if you're saying that books of Tanakh look like this, they teach us how to be religious Jews, and they teach us how to worship Hashem, and they teach us what our relationship with Hashem should be like. And then you open Megillat Esther, it's almost an anomaly. It doesn't seem to fit in to the model of the Svarim in Tanakh that we're used to. And yet, as we all know, it was incorporated, and it is included as one of the Chavdalit Sifrei Tanakh, and we read it every year on Purim, and it's one of, as I mentioned, one of the most beloved Sfarim, one of the most well-known and one of the most beloved. And so what I wanted to do today is offer what I think are really two reasons for that, for why that is, why despite its anomalous nature, Megillat Esther is so important within our religious experience. So I think that it really sort of comes down to what Megillat Esther is trying to do, right? And if you think about it, all the different Svarim in Tanakh are all asking different questions, and they're all answering different questions, right? If you look at Sefer Eov is a man who is suffering, who has experienced what he believes is Hashem's cruelty and the lack of justice in the world, and he's trying to make sense of his suffering in light of believing in a just God, and that's what Sefer Eov is addressing. If we read Sefer Yonah, for example, Yonah doesn't see God as harsh. Yonah sees Hashem as too merciful. Yonah sees Hashem's overweening rachamim on people that don't deserve it, right? If we look at Sefer Shoftim, for example, we're talking about a period where there's no centralized leadership, and we see how there's this deterioration of society. And if we read, for example, Sefer Shmuel, we see a centralization of power, but then we see how power corrupts people, right? So every Sefer in Tanakh is addressing different questions, looking at a different reality, and coming up with answers to how to deal with that specific reality. And that's why every Sefer in Tanakh is not going to be identical. Every Sefer in Tanakh is not going to be making the same nuanced points, but every Sefer in Tanakh can then becomes part of this corpus of Sfarim that we have, and when we have all 24 Sfarim together, then what we have are, in theory, all of the answers that we could possibly be looking for. So one of the things that's really interesting about Megillat Esther is the very thing that might have made it disturbing to some of the Jews in the land of Israel that were writing, and that is that Megillat Esther is not talking about what it looks like to live within the land of Israel. Megillat Esther is addressing what it feels like to live outside of Eretz Israel. And so if you look, and I'm just going to give you one example, just so that when you're listening to the Megillah on Purim night, you have something to sort of ground you. If you look at the first parak in the Megillah, one of the things that's really interesting, if I were to ask you, describe for me, David HaMelech's palace, you wouldn't be able to, right? Because the Tanakh doesn't really waste time on descriptions of anything other than the Beit HaMikdash in Tanakh. Right, and the Mishkan. If I say to you, I'm curious what the field of Boaz looked like when Ruth was gathering the barley. You would have no idea because we don't know. It just says Vayhi mishvot hashoftim vayhi ra'av ba'aretz. We don't get physical descriptions. One of the things that's so shocking to students of Tanakh when we open Parak Aleph in Megillat Esther is that it almost breaks with all the norms in Tanakh that we're used to. Right? First of all, you see this description. It goes floor to ceiling. We know exactly what the goblets were made out of. We know exactly what types of metals were used and what types of fabrics. We have this detailed description. And if you look inside, what's really, really interesting, it incorporates all sort of foreign phenomena. The names that are included in that first parak are Persian names that we're not used to. Mehuman, Bizta, Charvona, Bikta, Karshina, all these names, Admata, that we've never even heard. And so for students of Tanakh, we're almost thrown off guard. We don't really know what to make of it. We feel like outsiders in the text almost. We don't see David, Yaakov, Miriam. We see Charvona and Admata. Okay? There are even Persian words incorporated into the Hebrew. So it talks about Hafar Tamim. Right? Look in your Mikra'ot Gedolot, and every parish there is going to have a different explanation of what Far Tamim is because it's a Persian word, fratama. And so we don't even know exactly what all the different words mean. When it says Hashtiya kadat eino nes. So what's that? I don't know what the rules are in Persian. What are the customs? What's the social order? Right? And so on some level, what the Megillah does for us when we're reading it is it creates the experience of feeling estranged, of feeling like we don't fully belong, but at the same time, we're sort of drawn into the luxury and there's an appeal to it, and yet there's a strangeness. We feel there are pieces of it we want to belong to, and yet we know that we're foreigners in this strange land, right? I don't know if any of us in our own lives have had this experience, but I know I certainly, when I was growing up and I would speak to my grandparents about what it was to be a Jew for so many years and move to a brand new world and have to learn a new language and new mores and new cultural rules and everything brand new in a strange new world and start again. And so the strangeness and the need to sort of the desire to integrate, but also feeling out and like you don't belong is something that is so powerful in that first parak of Megillat Esther, specifically because Megillat Esther is a work that is talking to Jews living in a strange land who are trying to make it work, who are trying to understand how they can build their lives in this strange place. Okay? And so there's something really beautiful and sort of it's offsetting. It doesn't. We feel almost sort of disillusioned, and we feel almost dizzy by all the newness and all the strangeness. And yet at the same time, there's an allure, as I mentioned, to the beauty, and that's ultimately what Megillat Esther is really sort of that experience that Megillat Esther is encompassing. Okay. But I think more important than addressing just the sort of context of the Megillah, which we see it do so well in Parak Aleph. And by the way, if you read through all the prakim, you have that sense of the outsider moving in, very much like Esther, who is really sort of the metaphor for the entire Megillah herself. But I think more importantly than just giving us a context and creating, right? I sometimes actually tell my students that if reading a different sefer is sort of like watching a movie, so Megillat Esther is almost like putting on VR glasses, those virtual reality glasses, where you're not just watching something on screen. You feel like you are in the scene. We don't know what Haman is thinking. He's inscrutable, but Achashverosh is an open book because that's how their personalities played out in real life. Mordechai, he's almost like an enigma. We're not entirely sure where he belongs. Esther, as we get to know her, we get more and more insight. And so we're not watching a movie. We're participating, we're interacting with the personalities that the Megillah is presenting to us. But I think more than that, really, more than just providing the context and creating this sense of what it is to feel displaced and scared in exile, there's something else that I think is almost more important. I mentioned that the different works in Tanakh have different ways of talking about Hashem. Right. And we said, for example, I used Daniel as a cross reference. So Daniel davens to Hashem, and Hashem does miracles for Daniel, and the fire doesn't get him, and the lions don't get his friends. And in Sefer Daniel, there's one miracle after the next. What's interesting is that in Megillat Esther, Hashem, and I'm going to use two words that people I think imagine mean the same thing, but they're not. In Megillat Esther, Hashem is specifically hidden, but he's never absent. What do I mean by that? Put your VR goggles back on, and we're literally living in Persia, and we're watching things unfold. And then we watch someone like Zeresh, the wife of Haman, make a statement. Now, she doesn't say Hashem's name, but she says very clearly to Haman, right? The words we know, Im hachi lo talin pol, right? If you start falling before Mordechai, you better watch out. Don't mess with the Jews, because anyone that messes with them is ultimately going to fail. Now, she never says Hashem. But it's almost as if the more people refer to sentences or refer to things that we imagine is going to end with because Hashem is there, but they don't mention Hashem. So the more conspicuously absent Hashem becomes. It would be like me saying to you, don't think of a red hammer. All you can think of right now is a red hammer. Every time we see things that make us think of Hashem, but Hashem is not mentioned, it makes Hashem's absence that much more conspicuous, that much more obvious, that much more something that we're conscious of, right? Mordechai says the same thing to Esther. He says, you don't have to go in. This doesn't have to be on you. But if you don't just know, they will be saved, giving the sense that there's a promise to the Jewish people that we're eternal. So it's either going to be Esther who ensures that eternity, but if not, something or someone else will take care of it. So again, as students of Tanakh, we know who or what that is, but the Megillah doesn't mention it, right? And if we keep our VR goggles on and we keep reading, so we see more than once coincidences that abound, right? All these series of serendipitous events that Haman happens to be walking by just as Achashverosh can't sleep. And he happens to fall on Esther's bed just as Achashverosh was coming back in from the throne room, right? And we could list tens of examples. And one of the things that's so interesting is that these coincidences seem so far-fetched, and yet the cumulative effect of each little coincidence points directly to God's hand, and yet Hashem never reveals himself. Hashem never reveals himself in a miracle. Hashem never says, here I was this whole time behind the curtain. But with our VR goggles on, we, as the readers, as the students, as the people trying to make sense of what it is to live in Galut, are putting all those little coincidences together and coming to our own conclusions. Right? If we look at the reversals at the end, he takes the ring and he takes it off of Haman's corpse and he gives it to Mordechai. And we have, right, all, again, the tree that was saved for Mordechai is now being used for Haman. And all, just like the coincidences, all of the reversals point to Hashem, but Hashem's presence is never confirmed. And so as we read the Megillah, we're constantly cognizant of Hashem, and yet at the same time, we're constantly wondering how Hashem is going to play, how things are going to play out, how Hashem is going to get involved. Will Hashem get involved? And it's almost, so I saw an excellent example that someone once mentioned. Those optical illusions, you could look at a piece of paper and either it looks like an old lady or it looks like a young girl, depending on what you look at, right? Or it looks like two faces facing each other, or it could be a wine goblet. So optical illusions are fascinating because you can look at it 1 second and see one thing, and then you blink for a second, look back, and it's something else. Megillat Esther is the same way. You could look at the coincidences and say, of course it's Hashem. right? Or you can look at the coincidences and say, I don't know, maybe it's a series of coincidences, right? Think about the 6-Day War. Think about Milchemet Sheshet Hayamim. There are Jews that fervently believe, I count myself among them, that it was one miracle after the next, and Hashem was involved in history from the minute the war started. And there are other people that say, the army was great, series of coincidences, series of amazing strategic plays. And that ultimately, the reason Megillah creates that optical illusion with our VR goggles on is because ultimately at the end of the day, that's what the exile experience is. Megillat Esther is unique because Megillat Esther is not like Sefer Malachim or Sefer Yeshayahu or Sefer Yirmiyahu or Sefer Tehillim, where Hashem is obvious and Hashem's fingerprints can be seen everywhere and Hashem is communicating with Nevi'im. Megillat Esther was written later in history where Nevi'im were not walking the streets and telling us what we needed to do anymore. Nevi'im were not telling us how Hashem is going to interact in our lives and how things are going to play out historically. And so Megillat Esther, if you think about it, is almost sums up the quintessential experience of Galut, that we look for Hashem, we search for him, we want to find him, we believe we see him, but at the same time, we're never sure. And at the end of the day, it's the choice we make to choose to see Hashem in those coincidences, to choose to see Hashem in how history plays out. And I think that it's almost what's fascinating is, I listed all those reasons at the beginning that why Jews may have been, why Chazal may have been skeptical or a little bit hesitant initially to include Megillat Esther, and why the discussion was still being had later on, hundreds of years later in the Gemara. But I think that if we look carefully, one of the things that we notice is that those very elements that made the Sefer questionable when taking together account for why it speaks so profoundly to Jews that are still struggling the very same way the Jews in Persia were struggling. And if I could just end with one last thought, Naomi, you said in your tefillah that you were giving at the very beginning, you asked Hashem that we should all be able to love each other, that we should all be able to find a way to have this sort of respect bein adam lachaveiro. So one of the things I also mentioned at the beginning is that it almost looks like the Megillah is devoid of mitzvot, right? There's no halacha dictated in the Megillah. There's no Jewish person actually keeping a specific mitzvah the way that Daniel kept kosher. And yet, one of the things that's so interesting is that the Bein Adam LaMakom doesn't have specific examples, right? We don't know what happened in all of those cases, but a very different category of mitzvot were kept scrupulously. Right? One thing the Megillah is emphatically clear on is the way in which the Jews within the Persian Empire worked together. How when the time came, when they were called upon by their leaders, they fasted and they fought together and they risked their lives for each other and they celebrated together. And the one thing that has remained constant, and I think what the Megillah is saying is Hashem may be hidden. Right? Haster astir panai mikem. We may not always be able to see Hashem. The miracles will not be the way they were in the first temple period during the period of the Beit HaMikdash. But what the Megillah is saying is that when we can't rely on miracles, the speech Mordechai gives to Esther at that climax in that scene is when we cannot rely on miracles, the only thing we can rely on is each other and our responsibility towards each other and our responsibility towards the kihila that we belong to. And so I think it's so interesting, if we compare not just Megillat Esther, but if we compare Purim to other Chagim. So Megillah concludes with the charge for the mitzvot of the day. Right. And again, if there were different sefer, if it were a different holiday, so we might sing Hallel to Hashem. We might sing in a sukkah and commemorate a miracle Hashem did. We might even light a menorah and commemorate a miracle Hashem did. Megillat Esther ends with the command, the mitzvah, to eat, to drink, right? To engage the people in your community, to make sure that everyone is celebrating with you, even if it means throwing candies at people, to include anyone that needs to be included, to make sure to give them a reason to smile, to make sure that the poor that can't afford food have what they need. And again, if we think about it, if we say that sitting in shul and wearing those VR glasses, right? It's not reading about what's happened once upon a time. We're literally re-experiencing the fear, the trepidation, that experience of our lives being turned from one reality to the next in the blink of an eye when an evil man comes to power, and the fear, and then the celebration and the understanding that we could rely on each other and believe and look to see for Hashem behind the scenes. So then when we walk out of shul, when we take those glasses off, so we've experienced more than anything else, what we want to do in that moment is reach out to the members of our community and renew that sense of camaraderie through Mishloach Manot, and to look around and to make sure that everyone around us is taken care of. And when all of that is taken care of, we want to sit down at a Su'udah and bask in our community and in that which we have together and in that which we can accomplish together, not just once upon a time, but today and every day. And so we sit in the Megillah and we feel terrified, as we should, but then we walk out remembering the pride that we need to take in our Jewish community and in our understanding of how important it is to take care of that community and each other. I think if the last 2 years have taught us anything, it's how desperately, desperately we need each other, how desperately we need to connect, how desperately we need not just to keep mitzvot alone, but to keep them as part of something bigger. And I think that Megillat Esther reminds us of that. And I think Purim, more than perhaps any other holiday, gives us the opportunity to relish in our community, to thank Hashem for the hidden nisim, reminds us, challenges us, I would even say, to keep looking for him behind all of those perfect serendipitous events that line up perfectly, even if Hashem never steps out from behind the curtain. It challenges us to keep looking, staring at that optical illusion that is history. And it teaches us to remember to turn around and love our neighbors, Naomi, as you mentioned, and to really garner strength from the fact that thousands of years later, here we are celebrating together, eating together, and being thankful for everything we have and for the ability to have that unity. So I wanted to thank everybody and wish you a early Purim Sameach.
Wow, Yael, it's Naomi, that was brilliant, gorgeous, and amazing. Wow, that was incredible. Wow. Wow, that was absolutely brilliant. Beautiful. Wow. Thank you so much. That was incredible. Wow. Thank you. Beautiful.
Really, really pleasure.
Wow. Really incredible. We're going to finish off. Adele had mentioned that we should be saying Tillim 22. So Judith is going to say Tillim 22 for us, which is so apropos to after what Yael spoke about. So go ahead, Judith. And Yael, thank you again so much. I'm bothering you again to come speak to us. Okay.